Good morning, everyone in America, and good afternoon to all our guests joining us from Europe. I'm Jonathan, and I will be your host this week on Brewing Data. First, a bit about myself. My name is Jonathan Silverberg, and I am the co-president and chief technology officer here at AirSage. I've been with AirSage for 7 years, and prior to that, I served in various management and technology roles for organizations in the transportation, mobile, and big data fields. Today, I'm extremely excited to host this session of Brewing Data, and that is for three reasons. First, it is my first week on this great series, so thank you for having me. Second is today we'll be discussing the subject of mobility as a service and mobility on demand, which I was always fascinated with, both professionally and as a user of these services around the world. And third, and most important, to discuss this topic, we have with us today one of the great experts of this field, Ms. Carol Schweiger. With more than 40 years of experience in this field, Carol is currently the president of Schweiger Consulting and is the co-chair of the TRB Committee on Innovative Public Transportation Services and Technologies. I'd like to welcome her this morning. Good morning, Carol. It's great having you with us.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thanks to AirSage for having me discuss these really exciting topics. So thank you very much. Just a brief intro about myself. You mentioned I've got about 42 years of experience in the transportation consulting field, where I primarily help public agencies strategize about the technologies that they need. I help them procure the technologies, and I help oversee their implementation. And very recently have gotten into mobility as a service and mobility on demand. So I'm excited to talk about that today. Thanks again.
Great. Thanks, Carol. So let's get started with our main topic of mobility as a service and mobility on demand. So first question would be, in your eyes, what are the important elements to consider when planning a mobility as a service and mobility on demand service so we can align with the strategic, regional, and local priorities? Moreover, how can mobile data and technology be leveraged for this goal?
So I would sort of answer that question and start our discussion by saying it's really important to look at the topic from really two different perspectives. One is the customer side. So from the customer perspective, the key elements of mobility as a service and mobility on demand are that you can go to you have a one-stop shop where you can actually plan your trip, you can make any bookings or reservations, and you pay for your trip in one place. However, on the other side, which is more the institutional side of things, it's really mobility as a service and mobility on demand are more than just an app. And there are a lot of things going on in the background that are key elements. And we can sort of think about those as kind of the infrastructure that's really necessary. So you have some back office functionality, you have marketing and communications, for example, to reach out to people, to teach them about an application, about mobility as a service or mobility on demand. You also have third-party integrations. And one of the things that doesn't get a lot of press, but is extremely important, and I'll get to this a little later on, is incorporating behavioral science. And I'll explain why that's important later. But data is really one of the most critical components of that MaaS infrastructure, because there it's really integrating the data, not only for the customer, but for the services that you're telling the customer about, and things like schedules, like public transport schedules, real-time information about any kind of disruptions that might be going on. So those are really the key components.
Okay, so definitely you're saying that data is very important. So if we want to focus on the data, so how critical is the data communication, information sharing when developing the door-to-door mobility service? And specifically, what do you think the value of historical versus near real-time or real-time data is in this regard?
So really, mobility on demand really can't be successful unless there is a robust data infrastructure there. We have to have constant data communication, both again from an operational and a customer perspective. The information sharing here is really important. So you're sharing operational information with the customer as well as with the back office, the people that are actually operating that mobility on demand service. And when we talk about sort of historical versus real-time data, there's an extremely high value to both of them. On the historical side, if you're operating a mobility on demand service in, for example, an urban area, you might be subject to traffic congestion where the vehicle that's being used for the mobility on demand service is being held up and is not exactly on schedule. And you automatically want to alert the customer about that. If you have historical data about that, you can do a better job of operating that service. So if you know, for example, at 9 a.m. every morning in a particular zone, it's possible that that vehicle is going to encounter congestion, then that's a really important thing to know from an operational as well as a customer perspective.
All right, no, that definitely makes sense. Thank you. On a more broader perspective, mobility as a service promoters commonly, define the objective for, door-to-door mobility on demand as like individual freedom or collective efficiency. What are your thoughts on the value of mobility as a service, and how should it be envisioned in market?
So one of the first things I learned after the concept of mobility as a service was introduced, which is back in 2014, is one of the reasons the concept was developed was to give people the opportunity to live their fullest life. Transportation is so integral to our lives, and it's not just about going to a job, commuting to a job, or going to school. It's also going to entertainment or going shopping, things that are life experiences. So I think we have to keep that in the back of our mind. But getting to kind of the value proposition and the way it's being sold, I think we're still at a stage where we're not quite sure. We don't quite understand the complete impact on the traveler of having mobility as a service. And what do I mean by that? We really need to understand how that kind of a service will change someone's travel behavior. We know, for example, in North America, we've primarily lived with a car. And if you live outside of an urban area like I do, you don't have as many options available to you to make alternative trips. So here, that behavior, understanding what changes someone's travel behavior is important, And I think we need to start looking at things like micro subsidies or incentives to get people at least to try mobility as a service. The other thing that again is in that kind of back office environment that's hidden from view are the partnerships that have to exist so that mobility as a service can actually be successful. And really, um, that not only brings with it those mobility services that are willing to be part of that mobility as a service platform, but it also bleeds into the discussion about governance and policy making. You can do mobility as a service without those things, but if you really want it to be part of someone's travel behavior, we need to explore that governance piece. What we know is that if you make a trip from point A to point B, and I make the same trip, we are probably going to make that trip a little bit differently based on our own preferences and needs. Might be timing, it might be where we're traveling to, but I think that's going to be critical again. How do we get people to perhaps make better choices? One very quick example, when I used to commute into downtown Boston, being a public transport person by profession, I always want to be able to take transit. And the beginning of my trip from home is a 15-minute walk to a bus. And I would actually have people say to me, "You mean you walked 15 minutes?" To some people in suburbia, that's unheard of. So, how, for example, do you incentivize someone to take that 15-minute walk? So, those are my thoughts on that.
I definitely understand what you're saying, and of course, like you said before, I like the way you approach it. First, just looking at the individual and how that will change their experience in traveling, and then of course looking at the flip side. So really, we understand that as there will be more adoption of mobility as a service services, that will definitely affect and challenge the existing landscape of transportation. Let's call it, the incumbent, so to speak, um, modes that are out there. So, do you think that we need some kind of new types of governance that you anticipate would happen with the adoption of the mobility as a service offerings?
Yeah, as I mentioned a little while ago, you could certainly operate this in the absence of governance or specific policies. But I think it strengthens the offering if there is governance and particular policies around it. And I think some of the folks in the audience may be familiar with some work that was done several years ago to identify sort of a topology of mobility as a service where really the highest level and the most impact could be made if there is governance. And what I think about as governance is having the city or the region that is actually uh, providing the mobility as a service to their citizens and travelers is to really have them embrace that offering in terms of improving society overall, improving the environment, and maybe the governance piece is if you as a traveler make better choices, there will be better incentives. There'll be incentives for you to make those better choices. But then you can see how you're overall impacting society and the environment. For example, I was recently booking an international airline ticket, and the airline that I was booking with actually said, "Are you concerned about your carbon footprint?" And there are people that are going to be very concerned about that without necessarily having an incentive, but sometimes just providing that information. So if the governance piece is looking at how do we want to utilize mobility as a service to make an impact on specific things in our society, in our environment, in our institutions, I think that strengthens the offering and it strengthens the impact as well.
Right. No, I definitely connect with what you're saying, and take it maybe one step further. So if we're talking about sustainability of mobility as a service, so like what are your thoughts like from a financial and environmental standpoint? What would be the impacts of mobility service on these sustainability?
So this is a discussion that many of us keep having in the industry. Um, we have it all over LinkedIn all the time, um, and one of the reasons why looking at sustainability is so important is if you look at the mobility as a service industry and you look at the platform developers as well as the mobility service providers like the bike share companies, scooter shares, um, car sharing. A lot of those companies right now are being fueled by venture capital. And what that brings up in people's minds is, well, at some point, are these sustainable businesses? And that's why the discussion keeps going on. But some of my colleagues, and rightfully so, say that the question isn't really about sustainability, but it's actually more about how do we incorporate something like mobility as a service in our transportation sort of fabric. And one thing that I think about a lot is, particularly in the US, public transportation, for example, is highly subsidized by the government. And, you can argue about whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing to do, but we know that fares do not come close to covering the actual costs of providing public transportation service. So I sort of question, do we do the same thing for mobility as a service, for example? Do we say, well, we really need to subsidize that because we want to make an impact on people's travel behavior and we want them to make better choices. So we want to make it easier for them to have all those choices in one place. Again, be able to make any reservations and pay for it in one place. So I think it can be sustainable, but we need to kind of look outside of this one venture capital view that says, well, nobody's really making money right now. How can we support this? I think we need to look a little bit, beyond that at this point.
Right. So first, I have to say that what you just said is very, very interesting, and it so much connects to where I started. Is how fascinating the field of mobility as services, because it really has so many aspects, and it's sustainability and ecological and transportation and financial, and really very, very interesting. So that's great. I do want to end with one last question, which is not necessarily regarding mobility as a service, but another aspect that I know that you're knowledgeable in, and that is general about ITS and specifically the challenges and complexities of using data as part of ITS. I'd be happy if you can share a bit of your experience around this issue.
Absolutely. One thing, and I have to give credit to a good friend of mine in the UK who runs ITS UK, Jenny Martin, for really opening my eyes at a conference several years ago in the UK about ITS data and considerations about collecting the data, using the data. And some of this actually comes from an interesting book that was written about data bias, and particularly about gender bias in data, not just about transportation, but in other topics as well. And so when I think about what we need to consider when we're collecting or using data that is being generated by these ITS technologies, there's sort of four key areas. First of all, who's designing the systems that are actually generating, analyzing, and reporting this data? Like, what is really the purpose of this? Are we collecting data, for example, to improve safety? And if we're doing that, are we making sure that the data is not biased? A lot of old transportation safety data had significant gender bias in it. And we're just now realizing this. So we need to know who's designing the systems that are generating the data and analyzing the data. What's the purpose? I think the next thing, and we've all talked about this a lot, is data security. So that data that's being generated by the ITS systems, who actually has access to that data? And there are a lot of rules around data security, more so in Europe than in North America, but that's a critical factor. Another is, where is the data stored? So we is this available on any server, throughout the world? We need to have a little bit of information on where that's stored. And frankly, that's very important in transportation, particularly public transportation, that is now using a lot of scheduling software that resides on the cloud. And there have been some breaches of that data in the last year or two that have made the news that are really significant. So, where is that data stored, and who's got access to it, as we said before? And the last piece, sort of the fourth piece here, is data equity. So, how long is that data stored for? And the big question, how is the data being used? And we've now seen in our really modern world that data can actually be used for some very negative situations where, again, we're trying to target people in particular groups. And data could actually be used in a negative way, which is not what we want. So we really need to look at equity in the data that's being generated and analyzed, and making sure that it's being all used for good instead of a negative situation. So those are my sort of 4 thoughts on that.
Carol, thank you very, very much for this answer and for the whole session. It was a pleasure having you. I know I learned a lot of things. I definitely enjoyed this last 30 minutes. I'm sure the rest of our audience did too. And again, thank you and have a great rest of the weekend.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thanks to Air Sage and you as well for having me. Great discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Me too. Good. So again, thank you very much to Carol. And just in short preview for what we have next week. Next week, our guest will be Mr. Franz Lowenherz from Bellevue, Washington, and his session will be focused mostly on transportation safety. So be sure to tune in next week, same time, same place. Thank you, everyone, and have a great weekend.